Um, how's everybody feel? Feeling any stress? Any little stress today?
Little bit.
A little bit?
Yes.
All right. Well, this is a good topic to jump in.
We need some advice.
Maybe we should start this episode just with a deep breath, cleansing breath. I feel better already. This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. It's great to see you two.
Great to be here. Hi.
So, Dr. Cooper, you're having a little stress today. We talked about that before we hit the record button.
Yes.
You going to be okay?
I'll be fine. I just have to keep breathing, and it's nice to be with you two today.
Okay. Well, I think it's good timing because this episode is about stress, sleep, and metabolism. Who knew they were connected?
Not me.
So, Dr. Cooper, this is something you talk about with your patients pretty early on because it seems like there's a pretty big connection between stress and our metabolism, just at a fundamental level. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah. I mean, our stress levels have such an impact on our health in general, and it's kind of shocking because we don't really think about it. And when it comes to metabolism, when we're stressed, our ghrelin levels go up. Ghrelin is that hunger hormone produced by the stomach. And when the ghrelin goes up, it drives up our cortisol levels as well. And the cortisol is a hormone from our adrenal gland that helps us kind of adapt to stress. So we need some cortisol, but when it starts to go up above normal levels on a daily basis, then it starts to really backfire in terms of metabolic regulation.
So let's take a step back, Dr. Cooper, and I'd love to know just sort of what the medical definition of stress is.
Well, medically, I mean, I'm not really sure I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist or therapist. So I know that people come with complaints of feeling stressed. And I think there is a pretty high stress level in the majority of our population right now for various reasons. At least in my patient population, I'm seeing an increase. But I think it's when you feel like you've just got too much on your plate to deal with, and you feel like you're kind of drowning in everything around you, and a sense of anxiety. And medically, our stress system utilizes a bunch of different hormones, again, starting with the brain pathway and ending up with our adrenal gland that produces a hormone called cortisol, which helps us actually adapt to stress. So cortisol is actually good because if we didn't have it, we'd be real tired and sort of lethargic and just, not just feeling kind of apathetic. So once we have this cortisol response, it helps mobilize fuel and energy for our body to help us adapt to the increasing stress loads. And so we use this system all the time, and athletes use it quite a bit. So when you're training athletically, your cortisol levels go up, and that helps you access more fuel, access more energy, adapt to the stress loads of your exercise. And then when you're in a recovery mode, it kind of settles back down and resets. And you go through cycles of that. And in life, we can't really predict our stressors the way we can with workouts, for example. And so we can end up in situations where we're just inundated from all different directions with all kinds of demands. And that stress system is trying to constantly adapt and adjust to that. And as a result, if it's overworked, we go into something, it's called overreaching. actually. And in that situation, our cortisol levels get to be well above normal levels in a sustained manner. And as that's happening, we start having problems with falling asleep because we feel kind of amped up at night when we're supposed to be asleep. And we also have problems with our insulin levels can start increasing, our blood sugar can start increasing abnormally, and a lot of other things can happen that are, physiologically.
That's really interesting. I mean, if you look at the, biological origins of all this, there were times when we needed these hormones, right? Going into battle, going hunting, chasing food, running from danger. Those served us well. But what you're saying is that at elevated and sustained levels, these are not good.
That's true. Yep. When it's elevated and sustained, it's almost like, I mean, cortisol is a steroid. You've heard of steroids.
Hmm.
Not the kind of steroids, not anabolic steroids that people may take to build muscle mass and things. This is a different type of steroid that you take for reducing inflammation. Um, and so, but steroids also can affect bone density negatively. They can cause prediabetes and diabetes. So we're actually increasing our own body's steroid production, which then carries a lot of risk health wise. And if it's sustained for a long enough period of time, we can slip actually from what's called the overreaching state into something that's called adaptation syndrome, where we actually stop being able to adapt to the stress. Our body just gives up and sort of that whole system collapses. And then people will feel quite fatigued, like you're trying to get out of bed in the morning and you feel like you just can't get out of bed. You're just too tired. You try to do the exercise you were doing before and you just feel exhausted. And that takes longer actually to recover from that type of situation where you've pushed the stress levels so much that your body says, wait, we cannot be in an emergency red alert situation day after day after day. So we're just going to stop responding.
Wow. Andrea, when you worked in the corporate world, I'm guessing you had to deal with quite a bit of stress. You worked at pretty high levels at, some major companies in terms of marketing. How did you deal with stress then? And did that have an impact on how you ate or your relationship to food? Or tell me about that.
Well, I think I ate really badly when I worked in corporate because I would work really late at night. I mean, I would have sometimes, maybe 10 meetings a day, which means you're not getting your work done during the day. So I would work at night and you, I mean, there were many, many nights where I would eat pretzels for my dinner, not a nutritional guidepost there. And I'm sure that that affected my mood. I know it affected my mood. Sometimes I would be cranky, I'm sure. Um, Not good. I mean, and you go out to lunch a lot, it's rushed. Um, I don't think it's a good way to be.
Yeah.
And everything is like go, 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 go. But uh, you're not balanced. That whole work life balance never really happened. I traveled a lot, so there was a lot of room service, um, which is never that great. Although a club sandwich in room service is still one of my favorite things. Um, but it's just not a great thing to do in terms of balancing your diet, your health,
Yeah.
um, creating a schedule. Uh, I mean, as much as I would try, I don't think it's that easy to do.
Yeah. We've mentioned on the podcast you're a patient of Dr. Cooper and childhood friend since the age of 2. I'm a patient of Dr. Cooper for about the same period of time, 10 years. Dr. Cooper, the drugs that we're on to regulate our metabolism, do those also have sort of a calming effect on stress hormones that are in our bodies as well?
Well, certain medications for metabolism can really blunt high levels of cortisol, can actually help control it. Um, but one reason is that people with metabolic dysfunction often have a little bit of a glitch in the brain pathway that actually promotes higher cortisol levels, causes higher cortisol levels in the first place. And cortisol is one of those hormones, stress hormones, that also can be associated medically with some other medical conditions that we're not really talking about those. It's something called Cushing's syndrome, where you have high cortisol related to that. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about just generally elevated levels that occur because of glitches in the brain metabolism pathway. And there actually are medications that help correct that type of a glitch. So, depending on what your metabolic problem is, it could be that addressing the metabolism helps tone down the cortisol and bring it back into normal ranges. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that the cortisol levels don't necessarily correlate with how you feel stress wise psychologically. The cortisol is more reflecting a physiologic reading of how the stress is affecting you physiologically. So often I'll have patients surprised that their cortisol levels are actually really good because they feel psychologically quite stressed, and then we'll have the opposite where people feel like, well, I think I'm handling it, but the cortisol levels are saying something different.
And those elevated ghrelin levels, would that cause us to eat more than we normally would?
Yes, because part of the stress response, not just cortisol, driving the cortisol up, but again, as we described before, it's the ghrelin can increase with a lot of stress exposure. Ghrelin's a funny hormone. It actually has been found to increase even when you're annoyed. So it doesn't take a whole lot for the ghrelin to start acting up.
Would that be the chocolate hormone or the pretzel hormone?
Yes, it does. It
or-
does drive up like food interest. It reduces satiety and satisfaction after eating if your ghrelin is high. Ways to calm down the ghrelin are to try to, eliminate the unnecessary stressors as much as you can, or try to balance it with de-stressing activities. Get adequate sleep because ghrelin's affected so much by sleep. Eat on a regular basis. So it's kind of interesting because the stress can raise the, ghrelin levels, which can raise the cortisol, but the stress can also raise the cortisol just independently. So you can end up with really high levels of that cortisol stress marker in the blood, and then all of the issues that come with that. Most times people with real high cortisol levels feel kind of like you would feel if you stayed up all night, like, studying, or like you said, Andrea, where you were up all night working on your projects, where you have this, you're always on some kind of a second wind, but it's never really the very, that great of an energy level.
Right.
That's kind of what it feels like when people describe how it feels with their cortisol levels elevated.
But it's so hard because if you are a stressed out person and then someone says, well, you need to get a lot more sleep, then you stress about getting more sleep.
Yeah, it's true. I've heard that one too. Cortisol's been labeled as like a weight gaining hormone in the body, and it's not really, it does do the indirect, reactions with the glucose levels and the insulin and things, but it does cause fluid retention if it's elevated. So fluid retention in the trunk, torso, and neck area, in the face. So that's something, if people feel kind of puffy, it can be due to that.
That's interesting. And, I'm guessing the most medically efficient, way to deal with this is to sort of figure out what's causing you stress in your life. I remember we had an appointment one time and we were going through my numbers, my lab numbers. And you said, hey, you might just try taking a warm bath every once in a while.
Yeah.
And I was like, what?
Right.
But now I get it. I mean, just those little things, like every once in a while, to just kind of get the body to calm down, right?
Yeah. Taking deep breaths. Our stress hormones do have like a cycle throughout the day. So believe it or not, they're supposed to be the highest when we wake up in the morning. And that's to help us transition from being asleep to now having to get up and deal with the day. And so the typical high levels are around 8 a.m. And it does adjust if you're on a different schedule, a work schedule that's different that you stick with consistently. But that takes a long time to change that because it's kind of our nature to have that high level in the morning. And then it calms down. And then around midday, we get like another little burst. And that's to help mobilize that energy for us to get through that midday slump. And then we have a bigger burst right around 4 to 5 p.m. And that just helps again, like finish out the day. This helps bring us up to like giving us a little bit more energy, a little bit more bounce throughout the day. But then cortisol is supposed to be at its low point, like around midnight. It's supposed to be, really well down below the daytime levels. And if you get into that mode where your cortisol is elevated, it can just be persistently elevated all day long. And at night, when you're trying to fall asleep, it's what's sort of keeping you awake and making you feel still alert and not settled down. So we often recommend things like a warm bath before bed, doing some breathing exercises, just those unwinding kind of activities to try to reset that level.
Okay, so let's talk about sleep. Sleepless in Seattle was a great movie, but it's not a good life strategy. So let's talk about Andrea. When you were in corporate, I'm guessing you operated on very little sleep. Yeah.
Yeah, I still don't have the amount of sleep that I should have, but I've never had a problem falling asleep or staying asleep. It's just when to go to sleep. I think maybe I have like that fear of missing out or something, but I don't know. I just always like to read a book or watch something. I just going to sleep early has never been a thing for me.
Yeah. And Dr. Cooper, when we first started my treatment, you were really interested in my sleep schedule because in television news, you are either on early morning shows or late night shows. There's almost no, midday work shifts. So I was either going to bed at 2 a.m. or getting up at, 3 a.m., depending on the show. And that had a profound impact. I feel like I look back at my old pictures and I looked really awful, just, heavy and just, stressed out. And so let's talk about sleep and exactly what's going on from a metabolism point of view and why you were so interested and in all of your patients, you take a great
Yes.
interest in their sleep.
Yeah. So yours in particular, that schedule that you were working is about the worst type of schedule you can have for your metabolism
Wow.
because we want for our metabolic hormones to balance adequately and to reset to really kind of an equilibrium throughout the night. We need to be asleep between midnight and 4 a.m. to have the most optimal response. And the later part of that period, 2 to 4 a.m., is when our security signals kind of give a good, strong indication that we're not in a famine. We're not starving. Our weight is secure. And that reassures our brain to not try to interfere metabolically. But that's between 2 and 4 a.m. And if you wake up between 2 and 4 a.m., you're missing out on that positive part of that resetting cycle. And so between midnight and 2 is when the famine signals say their piece and they say, no, we are in a famine. So watch out. And then it's up to the brain to wait and see what do the security signals say between 2 and 4 a.m. And then it balances all that. So in your case, you were missing out on that really positive part of that cycle and you were waking up and interrupting it all the time. So you just were not benefiting from those types of signals.
And even if your day is shifted, like Mark's day was shifted or like my day is shifted, it doesn't matter. It's like cycled up to the moon or something.
Well, in Mark's case, you were doing that routine during your work days, but then on your non-work days, you were not on that same schedule.
Mhm.
You were going back to what was kind of normal in your family. And by doing that, you were not really able to reset it completely to a different type of a pattern. They have done studies with people who have maintained, that type of a schedule on a chronic basis without altering back to the normal routine. And there is a little bit of shifting time wise, in that pattern. But for most of us, it's not going to be enough to make a difference. And so it's not just the amount, just the times that we want to be asleep between midnight and 4, but it's also the amount of sleep that we get matters too. And studies have shown starting at about under 7.5 hours, we have, a deterioration in that metabolic signaling occurring. So if we don't get 7.5 hours, we're already in kind of a disadvantage mode metabolically.
So the body makes the chemicals and is churning them out like a factory?
Yes. Our body churns these chemicals out, and many of them are produced at a certain sequence of the day, certain time of the day. There are little peaks and valleys. Leptin, for example, the main peak is that 2 a.m., 2 to 4 a.m., and there's another one, 2 to 4 p.m. But a lot of hormones have this, and some hormones are released hourly in little drips.
It's almost like, I hate to use a food analogy, but it's almost like Lucy and Ethel at the chocolate factory, where they're like churning it out, churning it out, churning it out, getting out those leptins and those ghrelins and those cortisols. And it's all, it kind of explains why you have to keep like that food coming in at the regular intervals all day long, or else you'll be really messed up and cranky and not in a good way.
Yeah, you'll
hormonally, physically inside, as well as emotionally.
Right. It'll throw off that equilibrium pretty easily. All of a sudden, your body's trying to keep up with the faster pace release of the famine signals and slowing down the security signals based on what you're doing. So I look at it like a big laboratory in our brain that at night, while nothing else is happening, so our brain has the time to like really take in everything, where it's doing this full assessment of your metabolic status. And so it's waiting for the signals that are coming from your body that are saying whether or not your food supply has been adequate for the last 24 hours and or not. And then later your body fat sending the signals saying whether your body fat is secure or not. And so then it's taking all that into consideration. Then that affects your metabolic rate when you wake up for the next 24 hours.
You have to think of it as like the night shift is paid the same amount as the day shift. And they're working really hard.
Yes, really hard.
I love it that Andrea brought up, an I Love Lucy reference, which was awesome. There was also a Disney movie that took place entirely in the brain, and it was this interplay between all of the different facets of the brain trying to take control.
Wow.
And that's really interesting, Dr. Cooper, that the brain does that during the night. It says, all right, let's check in with the rest of the gang and see how everybody else in the body is doing. That's
it's kind of like the brain is the judge, and then all the like signals coming in are the like present your case, and then it decides. And that's
very judgy.
Yeah, that's why sleep apnea is also an issue, because sleep apnea disrupts the quality of sleep. So even if you're sleeping the right amount of hours and the right time frame, if you do have sleep apnea, that creates a disruption in this whole pathway too, because your body, not getting enough oxygen is a feature of sleep apnea that creates a lot of stress in the system and throws all of these hormones off also.
Yeah, and that's also been connected to higher incidence of all kinds of diseases. I have a sleep apnea machine, one of those pressurized things, and I get the cord wrapped around my neck during the night, but it's worth it in that, I think before I was treated, I can't remember how many times an hour. It was something like 30 times an hour I was waking up. And so
wow.
Every minute or two.
And you didn't even know it.
No, you don't. But you just feel terrible the next day. I used to fall asleep at stoplights. But that was...
you also weren't sleeping.
Yeah, I wasn't sleeping. Right. I was like on the morning show and also had sleep apnea.
Boy.
And so I would just put my car in park on the way home at stoplights just to make sure that I didn't.
Oh my God.
So yeah, but that's super important to do that. How come, Dr. Cooper, we as a society don't value sleep? It's like we'll put everything else first, and then if we have enough time to get enough sleep, we'll do that.
I know. It's just like, how productive can you be? And the funny thing is, it backfires because you'll be a lot more productive if you do get this, carve out the time for sleep, then you're more alert and you don't need to put in as many hours. But it is kind of something like Andrea was describing about her career and how that's emphasized. Well, get on this plane and okay, first thing in the morning, we've got this meeting. And
Right.
then I still need all of this documentation before you go to bed. It's just, yeah, it's,
Right. And it's only gotten
yeah.
worse with like instantaneous message,
Hmm.
like that you can text everything right away. And if somebody gives you a text, they want an answer right away. And, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when, things took a long time to get back to somebody. And now everything is instantaneous and everyone wants it now, now, now. And you feel that pressure and everything has to be done instantly. And it doesn't mean the quality of the work is any better. And it's funny because, like in Europe, where I'm not saying it's better because believe me, I deal now with a lot of European vendors and things take forever to happen. But, there's like a 2 hour, 3 hour siesta in the middle of the day. And uh, I don't think it's a very different mentality, but they are definitely more rested.
Yeah. I mean, we kind of perceive that as, oh, those, they're lazy, but actually
Right.
they're really, really smart, aren't they?
They're much more rested. And here we think naps are for babies and that, they'll get out of it after daycare, no
Yeah.
more naps.
And you would think with all of the technology, that's come into play, I think we all assumed that was going to reduce our workloads somehow.
No,
And same thing
it made
with
it way
AI coming
worse.
along, that we think it's going to reduce the workloads. But yeah, but then you just try to keep fitting more and more in somehow. So
What about eating near bedtime? You've talked about it's a good idea if you haven't had any food for a while to eat before bed. But there the old stories are that oh, I ate pizza and I had terrible dreams. But so is there? I'm guessing you still recommend having food before bed if it's been a while, right?
yeah, I do if it's been a while. Now, it is kind of individual because some people do have problems with reflux. Yes,
Right,
gastric
acid
reflux, right,
reflux.
Mhm.
exactly. And so if they eat too close to bed when you're laying down, then you just get a lot of heartburn. So you have to kind of, moderate it a bit for that. But for example, I had a patient just recently who stays up till like past midnight, which we don't advise, and then has their last meal finishing around 6:30 p.m. and wasn't having a snack in there at all. And so the concern is by the time you have breakfast the next morning, now it's like you've been
Starving.
fasting so long. So that would be a good idea, is to put a snack in between
Hmm.
dinner and bed. I always say if it's going to be more than 3 hours between your last food and bedtime, put a snack in. And if you're a person who deals with low blood sugar reactions, probably even if it's been 2 hours, because you want to have enough food in your system to make it through the night without triggering those famine signals to elevate.
How big of an impact, Dr. Cooper, can sleep and stress have on the metabolism in terms of weight gain and blood pressure and blood sugar and all that stuff?
It's significant. It's really significant. And again, people are different based on their genetics of what kind of triggers can set their system off. But definitely lack of sleep, high stress, we see it in people's lab work. You can see it, and not just in the cortisol levels, but you see people who have diabetes or pre-diabetes. There's a trend, ticking up of those problems. Insulin resistance, it increases. Um, and we actually see changes in the cholesterol profile, although I haven't been able to find any studies of how the mechanism would be or why it would be, unless it's just, part of the overall effect on metabolism that stress has. But we see it across the board. Definitely blood pressure can get alarmingly high with stress. So, I don't, the biggest problem is, what do you do about it? Because, I like to point it out, but I really don't know what tools to give people to deal with the stressors that they're dealing with. We have a lot of patients who are in that sandwich generation, they've got their parents and sometimes, their spouses, parents, dealing with a lot of health issues there, and then their kids and even maybe grandkids that they're dealing with problems in those categories too. And these are things that just happen. And so it's really hard. How do you navigate the stress aspect? Not all of it can be solved by just talking to a therapist so that part I find the hardest. The sleep is hard, but people can change that a little bit more easily than they can their stress loads.
Or you could do what Mark did and just get a whole new job.
So Dr. Cooper, came to me, our most recent labs, and she said my cortisol levels haven't been this low. I don't know if ever, right? Maybe 10 years.
Yeah.
And the only thing that's changed, I took this job with Work P2P to become a podcast host with the Beats Working podcast is my primary podcast. And then we do this podcast as well. But there is a direct correlation between the stress that I was under before and the lack of stress that I'm under now. 4-day work week, an amazing team, flexibility, understanding, on an incredible mission in terms of the work that we're doing. So I guess you can see that in the labs, right, Dr. Cooper?
You really can see it. And we often ask people, wow, what's going on? Because either the levels are really high or they've settled back down. And usually people can track it to very specific things in their lives that, are current events that are either, getting amplified and into major stress mode or calming down and they're rebalancing. So it's nice to see that correlation. And it's good, I think, to have people it's good when people are aware of what's going on physiologically and how their body's actually handling those stressors.
Yeah. Andrea, any advice on how to de-stress? What do you do?
For de-stressing, I think I sing in the car. Sometimes I go for a walk. Sometimes I get a massage, which I think is a good thing to do.
Oh, sure.
I actually really think it works. And I'm trying to think what else I do.
I think baking too is kind of therapeutic for you.
But you know what? As much as the baking is good for me, I love giving it away. I think that that's really fun, like knowing that what I made is making somebody else happy. I know that sounds really kind of nerdy, but I'm a nerd that way. And I like the fact that it's going to be in somebody else's house and making them happy. And I do like the process of making something. I think it's amazing that kind of ugly ingredients like flour and sugar, which are they're really boring and ugly, and they turn into something kind of great and pretty. I think that's amazing. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a de-stressor, I guess.
Yeah, I love it. All right, Dr. Cooper, any final advice? Stress, sleep, metabolism, it's all connected, right?
It is. I just think just keep your finger on the pulse of your stress level, just like you do with your other indicators. And when you should be able to feel that ramp up in the stress hormones because it makes you feel kind of like Mark was saying, you're going to be chased by a bear or something. When you start feeling that, take some deep breaths, think about taking a warm bath, go for a nice walk, get some fresh air, and look at your overall schedule. What could you say no to that you're currently saying yes to? Is there anything you can unload off of that, the amount of work that's on your plate?
And your body will say thank you.
Yes.
Andrea Taylor, Dr. Emily Cooper, thanks so much for being with us this week.
Thanks, you guys. Nice to see you guys.
And that is another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper, a Work P2P production. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.